Atamaria kia koto. Sorry I couldn't be with you today in person, but hopefully this format will be just as good, and I can keep my carbon footprint in check. So today I want to give you an overview of the Eco Index project, but first a little intro about me. That's my name with some letters after it. Ko kai tahu toku iwi, ko Aotearoa aparima toku runaka. So I'm Ngāi Tahu with whakapapa down the east coast of the South Island, but originally from Aparima or Riverton. I'm an economist on paper. I live in Christchurch and work as the principal researcher at the Agribusiness Group, where most of my work's in large science projects, primarily around the development of sustainability monitoring systems and decision support tools. I'm currently involved with projects on biodiversity, sustainable marine economies, freshwater, Maori housing, sustainability assessment and reporting, data visualization, artificial intelligence, impact dashboards, medical cannabis, a whole bunch of stuff. But the common theme being that I usually develop monitoring, forecasting, and reporting systems. So I also have a company called Matatihi, which focuses on Maori economic research and business development. I sit on a couple of Maori agricultural focused trusts, and I also founded a fintech startup called Kopanui, which provides social return on investment data. I also have a life outside of work, so here are a few photos that I carefully selected to make me look super awesome. My dog, Clever Pete, my daughter, Mizuki, who's actually awesome, my mountain bike, which is responsible for over a dozen broken bones, not so awesome, and my marae down south with authentic rust on the sign. So today I'm here on behalf of the Eco Index, which is a multi-year science project to monitor investment in environmental mitigation, amongst other things which we'll get into. Here's our core team, all of whom are amazing, a mix of ecologists, Maori academics, other brilliant people. The unique angle of this project is that it focuses on investment and improving our environment and exploring connections between investment and environmental outcomes. So in the Eco Index, I'm mainly responsible for developing the architecture and the method behind the index and coordinating the development of the project's digital outputs. There's really only two big ideas I want to discuss today. The first is a general comment on the state of our environmental monitoring in New Zealand. There's been a proliferation of environmental monitoring initiatives, both domestically and internationally. We're gathering more and more data while often failing to provide clear guidance on the scale of change required to reverse environmental declines and the specific actions required to do so. The second idea is that an investment index can provide a powerful overview of actions being directed towards environmental improvement. If we can understand the relationship between investment in environmental mitigation and its subsequent impact on environmental quality, then we'll have a better understanding of the amount of activity required to reverse declining environmental trends and provide a sort of a national map of where to prioritize investments to make the largest impact. Now, this is a freshwater conference, and the Eco Index is not exclusively about impacts on freshwater, but impacts on freshwater are a significant component of the Eco Index's work. The Eco Index is all about understanding the scale of investment being made into beneficial land management practices and the subsequent impact of those investments on environmental outcomes such as freshwater quality. So there's really three big challenges or opportunities, if you're one of those people, that the index is focused on. The first being how much investment is put into environmental mitigation at present, by who and where. The second, that what impact is this level of investment having on environmental outcomes, for example, on freshwater quality. And the third being how much investment is needed to reverse environmental decline in issues like freshwater quality. So over the past decade, there's been a proliferation of environmental standards, assurance frameworks, other environmental reporting and monitoring systems. So the UN International Trade Centre alone is monitoring over 260 different standards with environmental indicators. And in New Zealand, each primary industry has its own, often unique monitoring system, its own indicators and metrics, and its own set of initiatives to improve environmental outcomes. Regional councils, government departments, NGOs, community groups, large private enterprises, they all have a range of monitoring initiatives. We've got GAP, NZ GAP, Zespri GAP, iPhone, SWINS, the Water Accord, Lead with Pride, and heaps of others. And that's just a small selection from the private sector. I heard last week that there's over 70 unique versions of global GAP alone internationally. So a considerable number of resources are apparently being put toward environmental improvements. On average, government funding directed towards improving freshwater quality is increasing every year. Primary industries and local authorities have all committed resources to improve freshwater outcomes to different extents. And if you're one of the dozen people in New Zealand who actually reads industry and business sustainability reports like I do, there seems to be a massive effort to improve environmental quality. There's a lot of busy activity on environmental mitigation and monitoring, but we also know that native freshwater species and ecosystems continue to decline. 3/4 of native freshwater fish are either threatened or at risk of extinction. Many of our native birds rely on freshwater environments, and 2/3 of these birds have been classified as threatened or at risk of extinction. More than 2/3 of our lakes are polluted due to urban uses, farming and forestry. We have what seems like a heap of investment in environmental mitigation that is not, well, as yet anyway, created an environmental profit. So I'm going to largely focus here on the ecological outcomes of land use practices that impact freshwater, as this is where the Eco Index is developing initially. But this story applies equally to several outcomes like mahinga kai or swimming or amenity values, amongst others. There's obviously a gap between environmental mitigation actions and our environmental outcomes. Our environmental actions have so far not been sufficient to turn around our environmental impacts at a national scale. And this is a really key word, okay? So, it's an important disclaimer. What I'm talking about this morning is focused on telling a national scale story. So while I recognize that significant regional variations exist, I'm talking about the big picture, the national story. So there's many fantastic local initiatives that have made significant enhancements to our waterways, and I don't want in any way to take away from that. A big part of what we're doing in the Eco Index is learning from these successful investments and investigating the potential to scale them up. The national story is complex and varied. I often see people point to the complexity of ecological systems and the lack of detailed scientific understanding of all aspects of these complex systems as a kind of an excuse for inaction or to delay action on environmental issues. And there are limitations in our knowledge, of course, but if we accidentally do something better than the bare minimum, well, I mean, if you accidentally made more money than you needed to in a year, it's not all bad. There will always be exceptions to the national story. Some regions will be doing better, others worse, and this nuance will be developed over time in our models. So, national scale, your experience may vary. We know what's driving declines in freshwater quality. We know that the declines result from converting land to cities and towns, farms, plantation forests, and the associated pollution, changing waterways from their natural form, reducing flows, bringing in new species, either intentionally or accidentally. We know quite a lot. Our monitoring of impacts and outcomes is improving, and we've got a broad understanding of the environment's state. What we do not have a good understanding of is the type and intensity of mitigation actions that are being undertaken, and whether they are having a positive impact on environmental outcomes. So in other words, we have a reasonable picture of the outcomes of our actions, but no clear picture of the actions creating those consequences or those outcomes. A good example is the LAWA website, which provides a fantastic repository of outcome data. You can go into LAWA and see states and trends in rivers throughout New Zealand. There's no equivalent that I'm aware of that covers actions or trends in land management practices or mitigation measures that are driving the outcomes. And there are hundreds of indicator systems. Some are practice-based, some are performance-based, some have prescribed limits, some have targets, others simply monitor trends. They're all unique and all poorly integrated. Some amazing conservation initiatives run by community groups in iwi are largely unknown. Based on my experience, personally working on several different environmental monitoring initiatives, the challenge of aggregating data from different monitoring systems is enormous, and the motivation to do so is minimal. So this is a network map I created to illustrate the complexity of aligning just 3 indicators across 12 frameworks. And this was in relation to sustainability assessment. So the 3 indicators are human rights and local communities, soil quality, and supply chain responsibilities. And while it's possible to align these indicators at a high level, they each use a different metric for the indicators, so none can be aggregated, at least in a statistical sense. This absolute mess right here is only a tiny fraction of what's out there. In practice, there are many dozens of frameworks in use throughout New Zealand, some with hundreds of indicators. Without the ability to integrate data on mitigation actions, it's not possible to combine data to tell a coherent story at a national level of our progress towards improving freshwater quality. I've heard it said that frameworks are like toothbrushes. Everyone has one, but nobody wants to use anybody else's. It's much easier to build a new monitoring framework than to work within the requirements of an existing framework. And additionally, if you build the framework, you have full control over what gets measured and how it's communicated. I'm going to call this the hyperinflation of environmental monitoring frameworks, because economists. The scientific community is complicit in this hyperinflation of environmental monitoring frameworks, and reviewing academic papers on farm level sustainability assessments a couple of years ago now. I found 152 papers presenting unique farm level frameworks for environmental monitoring, only one of which actually discussed implementing the framework in practice, but that's a separate issue. The New Zealand government has traditionally favoured a voluntary approach to environmental monitoring and mitigation, while new regulatory drivers internationally and domestically are beginning to set more stringent requirements around what needs to be monitored. The primary environmental monitoring mechanisms used across all business sectors in New Zealand are non-regulatory. So the Eco Index is building a national picture of the scale of investment in environmental mitigation and comparing investment to impacts. So in our language, we're sort of, instead of talking about actions, we're talking about investments. Instead of talking about outcomes, we're talking about impacts. We have a bunch of co-conspirators in the Eco Index. This is a map of some of them, but it doesn't show most of the private sector groups we're working with. So we're working closely with multiple primary sector industry bodies and a couple of satellite monitoring and AI organizations as well. We've also had a lot of interest from the financial sector, including banks and the NZX, as an index of this kind opens the door for impact investors to become involved. So I'm just going to outline some of the big challenges that the Eco Index project is tackling. It wants to understand the scale of land management actions being undertaken to improve environmental outcomes, to reveal the scale of actions required to improve the outcomes, talking about the gap there, to use a common metric that can be aggregated across industries and regions to tell a national story, in our case, dollars, to provide industries and organizations a platform to communicate the scale of their investments, to empower iwi with quantitative data that reflect their aspirations, to reflect the scale of our environmental challenge in a way that's understood by everyone, to provide clear guidance around the scale of investment required to improve our actions, to improve outcomes, sorry, and to provide a map for targeting high impact actions. Investments, and what I'm talking about here, are things like kilometers of waterways fenced, or community conservation group work hours, could be riparian planting, that could be the opportunity cost of less intensive stocking rates, changing fertilizer practices, retiring marginal land. Basically, every action taken to improve freshwater quality is an investment in our environment. At present, we often see environmental mitigation actions presented like this. So 98% of vineyards use monitoring techniques in the vineyard to optimize water applications. So I look at something like this and think, is this impressive? Am I impressed? What does it really mean? Monitoring technique. But really, this is actually kind of good. The majority of sectors are not publishing any quantified information on their environmental actions. So I'm not picking on the wine industry. They were one of the innovators of primary sector environmental monitoring in New Zealand. But this kind of information is everywhere. 99% of waterways fenced, or zero waste, just for balance. That's here's something from the dairy sector from 2019. Set targets, launched a goal, piloted alternatives. But what we want to know in the Eco Index is, what's the size of the investment that has been made here, and does it warrant celebration? And if so, well, let's celebrate it. Let's provide a platform for any sector to demonstrate the amount of investment that's gone into making positive changes, and then the scale of the positive impact this investment's had on our environment. And this can be used to communicate to consumers, to demonstrate progress, to maintain social license to operate, to influence policy, or simply just to gain a better understanding of the sector's contributions. Sort of like what's done with financial data, clear and quantified. The Eco Index, it's about understanding how much investment has been made in establishing these waste targets, or how much investment has been made in establishing farm environment profiles. We've begun at a regional and sector scale, quantifying environmental mitigation investment and comparing it to environmental outcomes for each industry and in each region. And there's several reasons why we've put dollars of investment at the core of our approach. And in doing so, recognizing the limitations of dollars in discussing environmental issues. And you know, we have a couple of ecologists on our team to remind us of that. Investment monitoring, though, it provides a first step, really, towards a national index. The intention is to establish a nationwide reporting system that can be refined and made more nuanced over time. The lack of standardization between environmental frameworks at present means they cannot be aggregated to a national scale. And investments is a simple metric understood across any sector and can also be easily aggregated. You can clearly see absolute numbers and trends here on this chart. On top of this, we'll overlay trends and environmental outcomes of interest, which I'll show you soon. An investment index can be used to quantify actions and successes for an industry. At present, most sectors can only point toward the actions they've taken. They're not quantifying the amount of investment that they are putting into improving outcomes. And in many cases, the industries may be underselling themselves. So dashboards will be developed so that different sectors can compare and benchmark levels of investments to demonstrate their positive contributions. We're pulling data from a range of sources to work out the investments made in environmental mitigation. We've also established relationships with several critical organisations who will be providing us the data we need. This ranges from simple measures like the number of native plants planted to remote sensing data and spectral imaging. We have two approaches to gathering data. The first is data we can gather ourselves from existing sources and partners who have already agreed to share data. And the second is to seek more nuanced data from the private sector. This two-pronged approach it sort of ensures that we're not beholden to anyone for data and to ensure the integrity of the index. Any additional private data will help refine the index and allow industry to tap into the index's resources for their own use. But at the same time, we have the data to push forward anyway. We'll be tracking investment in a bunch of environmentally beneficial actions over time. This chart here is just a fictional example just to illustrate the combined investment in 5 beneficial actions over time for a single industry. And it's in relation to biodiversity, this example. But we're looking at pest control, fencing, planting, planning, and connectivity as beneficial actions to be monitored. And we'll also aggregate a range of sectors to provide a national story. And finally, when we want to overlay trends in different environmental indicators, for example, biodiversity health, we can start to investigate then the relationships between investments in environmental mitigation and environmental outcomes. This is what we hope to see on this chart here. Outcomes improving along with investment. But if the index were to show, for example, declining outcomes with increasing investment, then that would be a clear indication that we're prioritizing the wrong interventions. Either way, investment tracking should help us make better decisions. So investment also provides a clear target, which is something that's missing from many environmental monitoring frameworks. We measure our great actions and we measure our poor environmental outcomes sometimes, but we hardly ever quantify the scale of change required in our actions to reverse those poor outcomes. And understanding the investment gap gives an indication of the scale of improvements required. This slide here shows the scale of the challenge globally to meet the targets in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Our goal is to provide a refined version of this at a regional and industry scale for environmental issues in New Zealand. And this will help us build a national picture of how much investment is needed and where that investment is best applied. By quantifying the relationships between investment and outcome, it'll be possible to improve the efficiency of environmental mitigation investments. Some investments are likely to be more efficient at creating beneficial outcomes than others. These types of insights will help sectors better allocate resources for maximum impact. And quantifying investment can also help put things into perspective. So for example, if an industry or an entity states that $2 million has been directed towards improving freshwater health, that can sound pretty impressive. If we know, however, that 500 million is required to reverse declining trends, then we're less likely to be impressed or to become complacent. I want to focus here today on the concept of an investment-based environmental index rather than the technical details of the method. But something that sits behind the method, which is rather interesting, is that we're adapting macroeconomic planning concepts that have been used to grow economies and applying those to the environment. So all industries operate as a type of industrial ecosystem. There, a large array of inputs are required to generate an output. These are usually represented in input-output tables, and they give a regionally based picture of how much each industry relies on all other industries to generate an output. And input-output tables were created by this Russian dude, Vasily Leontief, who was awarded a Nobel Prize, so he knew some stuff, like this kind of stuff. So just humor me for 1 minute here and I'll get back to things that make sense. Input-output tables provide us with an overview of transactions between different industries and different regions. So each input has an environmental impact, and this concept's well recognized in greenhouse gas accounting, but it's rarely extended to address other environmental issues. But by combining an understanding of inter-industry transactions and their associated environmental impacts with an accounting of investment in environmental mitigation, we can develop a picture of the scale of mitigation in relation to harm-causing impacts. We're then modelling across multiple land management scenarios in New Zealand and doing some statistical wizardry to tell a national story. But like I said, I don't want to get into the functions and methods of Soviet economic theory here. I just wanted to mention this briefly so that you understand we're down in the details as well as being up in the clouds. Right, so I want to just start summing things up here and provide a stock take of where I see our environmental monitoring situation at present. I'm going to do this by co-opting this geological timeline. Based on most environmental monitoring texts, everything began way back when with the Brundtland report on the limits to growth. And sure, plenty happened before that, but nobody really cared. Things cruised along for a while and our understanding became more sophisticated, up to the sort of protozoa level of sophistication, and sustainability assessments started to gain traction. Then about a decade ago, the environmental monitoring equivalent of the Cambrian explosion occurred, which I think we're still in. Thousands of different weird and wonderful monitoring systems popped up and many have disappeared. Hopefully, having played around with all the different possibilities, we can start creating more complex organisms or systems that can do more than one thing. And who knows, maybe in a few years, we will have a small number of mega frameworks capable of amazing feats. But okay, look, there's only two main points I hope you take away from this. The first is that the Eco Index is a totally awesome idea. Or alternatively, we have little national scale understanding of our combined environmental mitigation actions and investments, and the Eco Index will overcome this limitation. The second is that if you're involved with any kind of monitoring framework, take the time to have a look around and see what already exists and how you can integrate with it. Yes, each context is unique. New Zealand is unique. Our environment is unique. But often the land management actions that impact the environment are not context specific. And there's thousands of indicators that have already been developed and integrated within global environmental monitoring and reporting systems that can be co-opted. So in summary, let's all share toothbrushes. Maybe not the right time for that. How about the future of environmental monitoring is in data integration, as well as remote sensing and AI and machine learning and all that other future stuff that I haven't even really mentioned here. So check back with me in a couple of years and we should have all the answers, or at the very least, maybe some crazy new ideas. Yeah, thanks for paying attention to all that. This is some contact details if you want to get in touch with either myself or Catherine, who's our relationships manager. And I guess I'll be joining you in just a moment for some questions.